Wow, okay. I realize that since I've been on here, since I've been on the tubes, I really have not actually, I really have not actually stated my beliefs about things, my thoughts, and expressed what it is I think. And I've kind of been ricocheting, and I'll continue to ricochet until I feel comfortable expressing what it is that I navigate about. And speaking of navigating about, some people claim that they're just, idea dropping, and that they don't have like a central base from which to, state a claim. They like to openly reference themselves to other people, which I don't necessarily think is a bad idea, but it's interesting to look at a thing, to point to a thing and say, well, that's true, is apodictic. It's kind of like in physics or in an equation. If you read the equation the right way, you'll reach a certain conclusion, but it takes the read of that equation in order to reach that conclusion. It takes an understanding of the joints of the equation, 2 plus 3 equals 5, and to read it conventionally left to right and then have it point the equation sign to the answer, where Aporetic is referencing kind of like a circumnavigation. It's like an underscoring of an idea. It's not ever pointing to the idea, but it can get at it. It's like the difference between truth and a truism. And so some people will operatically, with doubt, as opposed to with certainty, with doubt, as opposed to determinedness, they will be indeterminate, and they will take ideas and they will circumnavigate a point. They'll underscore it, they'll highlight it without getting to it. And this particular process, the Aporetic, is it's a particular type of, like Socrates has, answering a question with another question sort of tactic. Aporetic tactic is to continue a circumnavigation or a moving about, and then you have to kind of work in genres about things. And so I guess I wanted to just cover a few genres. Okay, like the notion. People see that I'm navigating around our favorite professor, his ideas again, because I want to take them on and open them up. Because one of my views is that everything can be. Let's see. It's not really a denial of truth. It's not a denial of facts, but that there can be a rewording of anything that's stated. So if someone's going to circumnavigate an idea or claim a truth, the next technique, I guess, is to move it into a truism, to reframe it as a truism, not necessarily as the case. Bring it into first-person vantage point again before one expresses it in some sort of objective third-person point of view. But anyway, with with that being said, let me jump in. The notion that a mathematical equation, right? Like there's a difference between saying this is what we are. We're an organism and we're a system, right? and then to say, and mathematically, the more we are able to describe with mathematical equations how our system came about, the more we want to say the system is the equation, right? As opposed to saying just the system is. We overlay it and say, oh, well, it's also an equation. And we don't want to separate this, right? These two, but it's not an equation. It's a biology, and so this notion that it's an equation is operatic. It underscores this idea without being that idea. So this notion of a like a post post-apocalyptic, Earth and all of humanity is wiped out. All life forms as we know them are wiped out of the universe. That somehow an equation remains true seems absolutely absurd. It requires an idea of an alien vantage point re-emerging, or a God's eye point of view to substitute for any consciousness. So it's really interesting how someone will get on here and they'll talk about relations are, require a consciousness, but then they'll in the next turn say that post-consciousness, an alien consciousness or a godlike consciousness would still suggest that an equation exists beyond us. And I'll even go so far as to say, kind of like, dreamless sleep means unconscious, and we know what that means because we have seen people sleep, and we've slept, and we've woke up, and we've talked to people around us and said, oh, you were in a dream of mine, or I was dreaming this and that, and they said, yeah, you were sleeping and kicking, kind of like our dog over there, or the cat over there, or the rat over there, or whatnot. And so we know what sleep is, and so and then this idea that when you find out who you are, you realize that you've already began. That's kind of like a reiteration of witnessing, like, oh, here's a child and the kid's not talking to me, and that goes on for several years, and then it starts babbling a bit and mimicking, and then before you know it, it's talking. And so it's like, as soon as something is able to make the word I and differentiate itself and understand the concept I, then all of a sudden they have a whole language in which to make a bias and make distinction between anything visually, anything auditorily, anything conceptually. All of a sudden they've developed their autonomy, and they go from human to person at that point. And that's when a lot of laws kick in to say, oh, this is personhood. It's a lot of historical ideas of, oh, that's when somebody is a person. Anyway, so this idea that kind of like even an orbit, right? If you say, well, without any consciousness, does a planet still orbit a sun or a star? I would go so far as to say, well, if there's any consciousness in a population, then yes, it orbits, because then someone can conceive of what this means. They can have a vantage point to this relationship. But if all population is gone, right, then to say an equation exists isn't only absurd, but to say that a planet still orbits another planet is absurd, because it, kind of like a tree falling in the forest, would require a consciousness in order to conceive it, or to invent a vantage point in which to describe this. And so people that want to carry on with this notion and follow up with this idea of prime numbers and the value of how math itself has its own particular quirks, and therefore that somehow would be the language of aliens, kind of like in the movie Contact, right? That it seems to me that like that by itself is anthropomorphizing, like, well, it's beyond us, and its nature is in the mathematics, and so of course this alien race would do this. But my point is not only is that assumption anthropomorphizing, but the notion of a post-apocalyptic supernova, no consciousness left. These people that think that an equation still is true, or that matter still exists, that a galaxy is still in a spiral, without having the word spiral, without having a vantage point in order to sense a spiral, or that it's kind of like blind people who have never seen color talking about the color blue, right? It's like, well, we have a certain degree of the spectrum of blue and that we can see, right? So if there were no eyes, and there were never going to be any more eyes, and there was no God's eye view or no alien's eye view, then the universe is just black. Blue does not exist in the same way that equations do not exist, right? And so the same thing. An orbit doesn't exist. The galaxy doesn't remain a spiral. An equation does not remain the same. It remains the same post any individual, but post a whole population, post all consciousness, post all eyes, post all conception. It just simply doesn't make any sense to speak of it as being the case, at least in my mind. So, what's really weird is that you'll get people that will image and identify and substitute this absence with this alien notion or this God's eye view to justify a spiritualism instead of routing it in a different way. And then in the next turn, they'll deny the empathizing with something that does have eyes, like a gnat or a bee or a dog, right? And they'll try to make the conversation, once again an operatic conversation, about, well, I can empathize with a dog, but I can't empathize with like a fish, because a fish doesn't have enough pain receptors, something like that, right? And so the notion of being able to conceive an alien point of view and actually entrust it, but then in the next mode, if someone says, oh, well, I'm writing a book called The Autobiography of a Wolf, right? They'll like, well, wait a second, that doesn't make any sense because you know, you're a human and I'm a human and this is human language, and therefore that is like not a qualified example. Like let's exclude that. And you know, instead of saying, well, look, I'm a species different than the next human, and potentially if I had a population of children and everyone else died, then I would be the human species and vice versa and so forth, but it doesn't really work that way. But I guess what I'm getting at is, as far as anthropomorphism is concerned, and the idea of the autobiography of a dog, or talking about like the first person story of being an elephant, or we're talking about the first person story of being a mermaid or a unicorn, right? It's the notion of imaging. Now, if one wants to believe in evolution and say, well, I come from the same source as a worm, right? I come from the same source, then it's not to say that the worm empathizes. It's not using words. It's not having an equation. There's no determinateness. So we're not going to say like, oh, the worm thinks about us, but to say that it moves, or it has a frequency, or maybe it has neurons similar to our pyramidical empathetic neurons that say, that's how the world moves, right? Kind of like the idea of sensing and empathy. And so I just want people to keep in mind this idea that, you know, if animals could speak, we wouldn't know what they were saying, and how it is we might interpret a dog's bark, an elephant's growl, whether or not ants are making tonal voices of communication with their antennas, or vibrations, whether or not there's something going on that we can say is the case, and whether or not to image that is somehow necessarily a violation, right? Because if it's not a violation, then we're not anthropomorphic.